Hello and welcome to this video on some safety tips for home brewing. Home brewing is a relatively rewarding hobby, and depending upon where you go with it, it can be very rewarding, but it does require some careful attention to safety, and this is mostly to prevent accidents, contamination, and ultimately spoilage. This is a reasonably comprehensive explanation of some safety tips, about 15, that should help with your home brewing, including how to implement them, and why each of them is relatively essential. Each of these will address a specific aspect of brewing, and we'll start with bottling and go all the way through to how to ensure you have a safe and successful brew. First of all, we have sanitize all your equipment thoroughly. Remembering to clean all your brewing equipment, whether they are fermenters, spoons, siphons, bottles, anything, with a food-grade sterilizer. Star San is the most common, but iodophor, bleach, or anything will really work, so long as it sterilizes, both before and after use. We say before because, well, storage is always a problem. There's a chance something could get in there, and after use because you've just filled it with yeast or whatever else it is you're trying to ferment with. And naturally, getting rid of that is, well, essential because you don't want that growing inside your, say, fermenter. Soak and or spray your equipment to ensure that all the surfaces have made contact with your sterilizing agent, and ensure that you've diluted it appropriately. More is not necessarily better. It just means you're wasting it unnecessarily. And then rinse, if you require it. Some of them are no rinse, but generally speaking, even if they are no rinse, we suggest doing so anyway. The reason for this is, well, simple enough. Everybody should be well aware of food safety, or at least the basics of it. Unsanitized equipment can harbor bacteria and or wild yeast. This can lead to, in the best case scenario, off flavors, and in the worst case, a spoiled brew. For example, your beer going bad, and sour beer is a style, but it's intentionally styled that way. You don't just get it randomly incorporated. Proper sanitation will ensure that you have a nice clean environment for your fermentation, and protect the quality of your brew, and arguably safety for consumption, although, depending upon where in the world you are, such as California, it doesn't really matter because you still have to put a label on it saying it causes cancer. To do this, it's very simple. Just fill a spray bottle with your diluted sanitizer solution and spray on all equipment surfaces. Then let it air dry. Depending on the case, you may then need to rinse it and check for any visible residual debris before going on to anything else. The second thing we're going to talk about is the use of heat-resistant equipment. This is mostly applicable to things like boiling for beer, but still, it's something to be very much aware of. Use stainless steel or heat-resistant pots when you're boiling your wort for beer. You want to ensure that you don't use plastic, mostly because plastic in most cases will melt, and the only way to really use it is in the microwave, and microwaving your beer wort is an interesting experiment. You also want to ensure that you don't use any, let's say, low-quality materials that may melt or, in worst-case scenario, leach various chemicals into your brew. Ensure the pots are large enough. For example, you want between 5 and 8 gallons, or approximately 20 and 25 litres. You want to do so to prevent boilovers, as, well, spilling what is essentially something very close to caramel all over your stovetop, and if you're really unlucky, self is going to be very similar to spilling napalm. It will stick to you, it will burn, and it will be very, very uncomfortable, if not life-threatening. And this is because boiling wort will reach temperatures of 100 degrees Celsius, and obviously, improper equipment will melt, crack, or release harmful chemicals into your brew. This can, at best, simply pose a health risk, or, worst-case scenario, ruin the entire batch of beer. So, to make sure you're doing this properly, inspect all of your equipment for any damage and, well, non-resistant components, let's call them, and make sure to ensure that it is entirely functional by filling it more than less 3/4 full and double-checking that it doesn't leak. In a related safety topic, we have handling hot liquids, and doing so with care. Much like with the wort, it's obviously a good idea to ensure that you're using heat-resistant gloves, long-handled spoons, and sturdy pot handles, because if you stir or move a pot full of a hot liquid, and these things aren't the case, you may, in the best case scenario, simply melt your spoon into whatever it is you're trying to make. In the case of wort, it's obviously going to be that. And if it's the pot handles and they break while you're trying to move it, well, yeah, that does not end well for anybody. Keep a safe distance from any boiling liquids, and obviously use a lid to partially control the steam release. Why you do this is fairly obvious again. Burns. Lots and lots of burns, because it's a lot of liquid, and typically speaking, if you're doing this in, say, a kitchen or similar, the height and everything else of the stovetop, the pot, and other things means if it spills, it's probably going to go from somewhere on your chest all the way down your legs, which means most of the front of your body will be burnt with hot liquids. And this is not something most people want. If you're, let's say, concerned about it, practice transferring 2 gallons of water and then later hot water from kettle to another vessel using heat-resistant gloves and a ladle, and just to get used to the process. Next, we want to talk about the wort itself and cooling it quickly, and how to do so safely. The best case scenario is you have a wort chiller. This is something like, say, an immersion counterflow or plate, which helps to bring the hot wort down to a yeast pitching temperature very quickly. Typically speaking, somewhere in the range of 65 to 75 freedom units, or 18 to 24 degrees Celsius. This occurs over somewhere in the range of 20 to 30 minutes. If this is impossible, and that's not always the case as it's a somewhat specialized piece of equipment you'll gradually want to get, but you may not necessarily have to start with, you can get away with, say, placing the kettle in an ice bath, or alternatively, taking a smaller pot that you can fit within your larger wort boiling kettle, and fill this with cold water and or ice, and put this inside the wort. This acts as a sort of heat sink and draws the heat out of the wort. You can do so rapidly. Just be aware that the pot you use for this may experience damage because you're taking it from a very cold environment where it's filled with ice and water into a very hot environment where it's going to rapidly see a temperature change. The reason you want to rapidly cool your wort, though, is very straightforward. There is what's considered the danger zone. This is an area in which bacteria grow extremely well. It's 40 to 140 freedom units or 4 to 60 degrees Celsius. When you have a lot of time in this danger zone, you have an increased risk of off flavors, and you have an increased issue around prolonged heat exposure. Slow cooling can also cause issues around stress to yeast. So if you have concerns about this, you can try essentially simulating the entire situation with a boiling gallon or 4 liters of water, and using an ice bath or other method to cool it down, and this is one way to get used to the idea. And next we have ventilation, and, well, you want to brew in a reasonably well ventilated area. Not necessarily outdoors, but certainly under, say, a range hood. Open windows and fans are another way you can deal with it. Partly to disperse steam, which will be generated in a reasonably large quantity, but also any fumes. The fumes aren't necessarily as much of an issue, but the smell can certainly hang around. Boiling water will produce steam and certain volatile compounds. Now, for some people, this can cause respiratory irritation, and the condensation from the boiling process can damage some things in an enclosed space, which is one reason why ventilation is helpful. The other issues are less obvious unless you're doing this on a very large scale very regularly, but you may encounter some issues around health risks related to mold growth if you have an excessive buildup of moisture. Next we have the handling of glass carboys in particular. This is less often an issue now, as most of these have been replaced with plastic, but be aware of the fact that, well, it's glass. The carboy can break because it is made from glass, and they're relatively fragile. To make sure you don't have any issues, just inspect it for cracks beforehand, and try and avoid any sudden temperature changes. This is obviously not as much of a problem, but it is definitely worth being aware of. The use of plastic is one reason why this is so common now, because, well, you don't have that issue of it cracking and breaking. That's not to say that it can't be used, just be aware that you need to be a little more careful in how you use them. And a related topic of food-grade materials, and the fact you should be using them. Make sure that all the equipment you're using, buckets, tubing, bottles, etc., are made of food-grade plastic, stainless steel, glass, etc. You want to avoid using non-food-grade plastics or metals because, first of all, they can corrode, which means you're wasting equipment, money, and time, and possibly introducing contaminants, and also they will leach chemicals, which obviously not ideal, especially if it's, say, rust. Why you don't want to use non-food-grade materials is, well, as mentioned, contamination, but particularly toxic substances. PFAS are common now and a big worry. Microplastics are another, and there's a range of other issues, but all of these can present health risks, and more importantly, at least in terms of home brewing, affecting flavour. Food grade materials are meant to be safe and they're designed with that in mind, and they shouldn't affect anything, and they generally aren't consumable in the same aspect. Then we have bottling and, importantly, overpressurization. This is when you use way too much priming sugar and you end up with way too much CO2 being generated and your bottles break. Now, if you are lucky, and this is generally what's going to happen, the cap will come off. Now, if it's a swing top bottle, this is much easier because it simply pops off and you get a massive mess, but the bottles aren't broken. If it's a crown cap, occasionally the cap will burst off and, again, you get a mess, but not so bad. In other cases, though, the glass bottle itself will break, and unfortunately, well, that's not so ideal. You have a ticking time bomb in the form of a glass bottle that's about to burst, and you don't know when. Most brewing bottles are designed for this reason, to not only be meant for higher pressure, more so than, say, for example, with soft drink bottles or soda, pop, whatever you wish to call it, but also you should be using a priming sugar calculator to get the correct amount of sugar for what you're using. Of course, there's always the basic safety stuff of check for cracks before filling, and, well, avoiding excessive priming sugar, and or using it in bottles that have some sort of weakness. The reality is that if you don't do that, you may or may not experience a problem, but, well, if you do experience a problem, there's a good chance you're going to be going to the hospital. Storage of chemicals, which is a fairly generic thing, which should always be followed regardless of whether you're brewing or not, but store your chemicals safely. Cleaning agents, for example, sanitizers, etc. Keep them in clearly labeled containers, keep them sealed, store them away from food, children, and pets, although in some instances children and pets are basically the same thing, and make sure you follow the manufacturer's instructions for safe use and, importantly, disposal. A lot of brewing chemicals can be and, well, are caustic, and because of this, they are toxic if mishandled, misused, or exposed to certain exposed skin in a fairly raw format that is undiluted. This can cause burns, poisoning, and or contamination, so just be aware of it. We then have fermentation temperature and the fact you should be monitoring it. Use a thermometer to keep your, well, ideally entirety of the fermentation at a relatively constant temperature. This is between 65 and 72 freedom units for ale and 48 to 55 degrees for lager. You basically want roughly 18 to 25 for ale and somewhere between 10 and 20 for lager, Celsius. Use a fermentation chamber or a swamp cooler if needed for this, but we would argue something like a heating mat is going to work as well, and in some instances a submersible cooler. The reason you want to avoid incorrect temperatures is partly off flavors and fusel alcohols. Both of these are related and obviously not ideal, but another issue is that if you ferment at too high a temperature, and possibly for too long, you get things like methanol, which can cause blindness. So obviously not great. We have a more direct and rather, depending on your age, more important issue, and that's proper lifting techniques. The reality is that a fully filled fermenter, that is, say, a 5-gallon or roughly 25-litre fermenter, when filled full of brewed beer, is going to weigh somewhere in the ballpark of between 25 and 30 kilograms, depending on exactly how full it is. Sometimes a bit less, but let's work on that basis. If you lift this incorrectly, well, your back will not necessarily experience pain the first time, but after, say, a few months, a few years, you're probably going to start feeling it. So bend at your knees, keep your back straight, and use lifting techniques properly to pull up heavy items. This does also have some bearing on spills as well, where improper lifting, especially if you have a sudden twinge in your back of pain, means you may spill something very full, very hot, and or very heavy. We then have contamination from pets and pests and avoiding it. Obviously, brew in a clean and closed area, preferably away from pets or open windows that may allow insects in. You want to cover your wort and fermenters tightly during cooling and fermentation. A wort in particular is very attractive to, say, fruit flies and similar. They want the sugar, same way they want the sugar out of fruit. They can, as a result, bring in yeast and other bacteria and microbial organisms that will arguably ruin your brew. As a result, you want to avoid them. Pets are less of an issue in many cases, other than possibly fur if you have a particularly furry pet, or a cat who likes to knock things off the bench. In both of those cases, there's sort of a unavoidable consequence of having that kind of pet. So you want to avoid issues around pets introducing pests and foreign objects, but bacteria in particular from pests, and to a lesser extent debris from that. You want to avoid, let's say, introducing unwanted, how do we describe these? Variables, let's call them. Use a hydrometer safely, because much like the cowboy, a hydrometer is nearly always made of glass, and you want to be very gentle with it. And this is one reason why having the form that comes in essentially a plastic sleeve or a tube with foam packaging to keep it intact is ideal. You want to ensure that, to start with, that any readings you do so with the hydrometer are done so in a sanitized hydrometer tube, and you want to clean it after each use. You also want to ensure you do so very gently, as they are, first of all, made from glass, so you can wind up with shards of glass in your beer, which is an interesting choice of ingredient and one we do not advise, but also the content of the hydrometer can be a concern. Now, depending on how old it is and exactly how it's made, they may have used mercury as the metal of choice to make it the right weight. Other more recent choices have been things like lead. Both of these are typically not great additions to your beer. Make sure then, as a result, that you have an intact hydrometer and that you're using it accurately. And this will also ensure that you don't overcarbonate bottles and that you have a complete fermentation. This is easy enough to practice, and just making sure you have it correct by taking a hydrometer and filling the necessary tube with a sample of water, for instance, and checking that it does exactly what it's supposed to do. If it's not reading correctly for your water, and you're confident your water is at least close to, not necessarily pure, but has very few other substances in it that should affect the reading, you need to check that it's intact. One way to make sure that it's not the water from your tap, and say the hydrometer, is to use distilled water. And next we have protective gear, which most of the time this is more common sense items than it is anything essential. Wear closed-toe shoes to start with. Obviously, spilling a hot liquid on your feet isn't so bad if you're wearing closed-toe shoes, because it'll go on the shoe, not your toes. If you decide to wear clogs, sandals, or other open-toe shoes, you're going to have a very bad time. Long sleeves are another useful one, although we recommend not having full-length sleeves, only because they tend to hang a little bit loose from your wrist, and as a result, it can drag through whatever you're brewing. This does mean that in the case of hot liquid, you now have a hot liquid being drawn up the sleeve of whatever you're wearing and now coming to contact with your skin. Safety glasses can be useful, but they're not absolutely essential. They're more if you're particularly, let's say, working with something that's active. Distilling is a common example where you will have a certain amount of vapor being generated. Gloves are another item, but more important when working with caustic solutions, mostly sterilizing agents. The reason for this is the same as with everything else. You want to reduce the risk of possible harm from things like spills, exposure to chemicals, and so on. And finally, we want to talk about the storage, particularly storage of beer. You want to store bottles or kegs of beer in a cool, dark place, somewhere between 50 and 55 freedom units or 10 and 13 degrees Celsius. You want to ensure it's kept away from heat sources and light. You do want to check the bottles periodically for signs of overcarbonation, for example, bulging caps, but you probably want to not check them too frequently, as this will expose them to light and possibly cause some agitation of the bottle. If you improperly store your beer, for example, it can cause off flavors, spoilage, and other issues. And if you don't check it and there's a bottle explosion, you're going to have the contents of the bottle dry or at least become very sticky inside of whatever you're storing it in, and this can make cleaning very difficult. By checking it regularly, and ideally at least once a month, you ensure that the beer will remain safe and palatable, and it gives you an opportunity to take one of the bottles out, check it, and see what it tastes like, and decide on exactly what the sweet spot is with regards to time in storage versus flavor. To incorporate most of these steps, you can create a fairly straightforward pre-brewing checklist. This should involve something like sanitize all equipment and confirm food grade status of everything you're using. Make sure you're set up in a ventilated, clean brewing area, free of your pets and or pests. Inspect your equipment for damage and ensure that it's all heat resistant if it needs to be. And make sure you're wearing the appropriate kind of clothing, or you're going to be if you go do this, say for example the next day. Monitor the temperature during boiling, cooling, fermentation, and even to an extent during storage. And make sure you are using reasonably precise measurements for things like priming sugar and storing your chemicals safely. And finally, store your finished beer correctly and check for issues very regularly. These practices overall should prevent injuries. Mostly we're talking about burns, cuts, and strains, and possibly, in an extreme outlier, the experience of what a claymore is like if you make your own using a beer bottle and overcarbonation. It ensures the beer is safe to drink by avoiding contamination and or chemical leaching, and protects your equipment and home from damage. Following all these steps should improve the quality and consistency of your brew, or at least minimize any variation, which is sort of similar but different in that you may not get better brew, but at least it won't get worse, most of the time. It also means the process should be not necessarily more enjoyable, but at least more rewarding in that you don't have all that time and effort wasted with broken bottles, a beer that tastes like crap because you unfortunately contaminated it, and similar. One note we will point out that's important but not necessarily part of the brewing process is we do recommend having either a fire extinguisher or a fire blanket nearby whenever brewing, particularly as the boiling process does introduce some fire risk. Now, this is more important if you're working with more combustible materials or you're using, say, a gas hob or gas stove, and that's because obviously open fire. In the case of electrical, induction, and similar, these stovetops are less of an issue, but the risk does exist, and so it's always worth having these on hand just in case. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing, and please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.